We have the economic wherewithal, both within the United States and working with our allies, to be the strongest economic unit, in contrast to our adversaries around the world. Make no mistake about that.
200 years ago, America's first line of defense was drawn here, at the bridge in Concord. But that defense came at great expense to a young and struggling nation, a nation that desperately needed protection, but could barely afford it. In the years since, our Congress has approved many budgets for defense. But where those costs were once hotly debated and grudgingly approved, today billions are added to the defense budget, with little debate for the economic consequences and little analysis of how these radical increases affect your standard of living and inflate your dollar. In the United States today, guarding against attack requires a commitment from science, energy, labor, technology, and raw materials that is in direct competition with the private sector's needs for the same materials. The balance between what can be spent on defense and what must be spent in the private sector is a delicate one. And in the next half hour, we'll demonstrate to you just how delicate it really is.
There isn't one weapon system, not one weapon system, in which the United States is now embarked upon, has planned, or is about to implement, that is actually restricted by this particular agreement. This is a matter of some concern to many members of the United States Senate about whether we really are bringing a significant reduction in terms of the areas of arms limitation. But there isn't a single system. There's the slickums and the glickums, the ground launch, the sea launch, and all of the other weapon systems. There is no country that is superior to us militarily, and there is no group of nations, no single nation, that is ahead of us in terms of our economic power.
Prior to World War II, the only consideration for military spending was the need for weapons. The military and the industry that supported it would grow and recede depending on the nation's need. After World War II, however, the military-industrial complex did not recede and has played an ever-increasingly important role in determining American economic policy. But since that role is essentially non-productive and is financed by the national treasury, it is important to determine at what point that drain affects the health of the economy. For an answer to that question, we went to economist Kenneth Galbraith.
Well, there's no very tight point, that one can mark. But what one can certainly say is that the more we spend for defense, the less we have for the modernization of our civilian industry, the more difficult will be our problem of foreign competition, and of course the less we will have for urgent public and other private needs. This is the calculation that we must make whenever we hear this loose general talk about adding another $3 billion, another $5 billion to the arms budget.
Could you relate how the defense spending relates to the health of the economy in certain specific areas, for instance, to inflation?
Well, there are, of course, two causes for inflation I think we now come to recognize. One is the general thrust of higher wages, strong corporations increasing their prices, and other things going up in keeping. And the defense budget has a particular relation to inflation there because we have what might be called soft pricing there, cost-plus pricing. It's very easy to increase costs, increase prices, increase wages, pass those costs on to the taxpayer. But the other thing, which is the old-fashioned and orthodox effect, is that if more we spend on arms, plus what we spend for investment in new plant and equipment, plus what we spend for consumers' goods, that budget, that total demand, pressing on the capacity of the economy, which at any time is limited, bids up prices. And so the more we spend on defense, the more we feel that we're forced to spend on defense, the greater will be that effect on inflation.
Okay, you mentioned the cost-plus factor in terms of defense contracting. Is there anything you would recommend in changing that procedure?
Well, I'm not sure that I would. This is a technical matter where one must be cautious about making recommendations. I suspect that all defense expenditures will be very soft as to their costs and as to their prices. You're dealing with people who can always ask for more, and it's always possible to meet their demands by easing a little bit up on the contract side or allowing a bit more in the form of a cost overrun. So I don't think we will ever have a very tightly budgeted, tightly controlled price system where military supplies are concerned, military weaponry is concerned.
Okay, well let me put it this way then. Do you think that that a cost plus profit situation encourages competition and encourages efficiency?
Oh no, no. Nobody, I think, has ever dreamed of suggesting that. No, no. It is an invitation to higher costs, inefficiency, overstaffing, both by those who sell and by those who buy.
Senator Tower has stated that some of the money, or most of the money, that would come to help pay for these new weapons could come from the cleaning up of badly managed social programs.
Well,
I feel that's true.
Senator Tower's an amiable man. He's an old friend of mine. But I think it has to be said that Senator Tower has not thought this through. Government, neither in the Soviet Union, nor in the United States, nor in Britain, nor in France, is ever perfectly efficient. But you cannot take money away from any government program and expect it to function as before. What Senator Tower is saying is that the poor people of Texas or of New York or wherever should be the people who pay for the weapons, mothers with dependent children, the old, the handicapped, people who are unemployed and unemployable. That there's no way of taking money out of those programs without denying them income. And I don't really think Senator Tower would seriously argue that that is the way to pay for new weapons.
Before another 3 Mile Island, before the MX missile program is into its 15th cost overrun, how can the American people determine whose viewpoint represents their best interest?
I should say that what he does is follow his instinct that the people who have an economic interest in the American sensitivity to economic interest is very high, and that the people who have an economic interest in weapons and an economic and bureaucratic interest in their perpetuation, that he follow his instinct that those people are not on his side, and that the members of the Senate and the President and the people who are urging SALT II are doing so not because they're part of that interest, but because they are on the side of the people who want to survive and live and have a better working economy than we have now.
John Kenneth Galbraith has been discussing what the arms race means to the economy. Paul Warnke, the chief negotiator for the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty for the United States, will discuss what SALT II means to the arms race.
Secretary Brown has indicated that in the absence of SALT, he sees that we would have to spend something between $5 and $7 billion a year extra over the next 10 years. That expenditure of additional billions would not give us any greater security, and that's the second and perhaps the most important perspective in which to look at what would happen if SALT failed. In the absence of SALT, our estimates, conservative estimates, are that the Soviet Union would go up from its present 2,500 strategic nuclear delivery vehicles to something like 3,000 by the end of 1985, which is the expiration of SALT II. Those strategic nuclear delivery vehicles, of course, are the ICBM silos, the launchers on the ballistic missile submarines, and the strategic bombers. With SALT, they go down to 2,250. Or would you rather have 3,000 nuclear delivery vehicles aimed at the United States, or something like 25% less. In the absence of SALT, they could go up from their present 5,000 strategic warheads to something like 18,000. With SALT, they can still increase, but they would only get up to about 9,000. Wouldn't you prefer to have 50% less directed at the United States, particularly when the MX depends upon limitations on the number of warheads to permit it to have an impact on the survivability of American forces? And then look at it from the political standpoint. SALT has been under negotiation now since 1969. SALT II has been under negotiation since 1972. It's been negotiated under 3 presidents, 2 Republicans, 1 Democratic. We've done it in close consultation with our NATO allies. If SALT now is rejected, what is the rest of the world going to think? They're going to think we don't know what we're doing.
Our defense industry operates in our economy under its own set of rules and with a government-guaranteed profit, making it immune to the natural checks and balances of the free market. As an example, a recent Pentagon proposal for the MX missile system called for the use of so much cement it would have caused a nationwide shortage. If that option had been used, what would the effect have been on you, the consumer? A decrease in the supply of an already scarce and expensive commodity, which would raise the price and deprive the housing industry of an essential building material. But the impact does not end there. Upon completion of an MX missile, the missile and all its accumulated value would be buried in the desert, with the hope that it would never be used. If you take the same amount of investment in construction, upon its completion a new process begins. The people who built the homes can now improve the quality of their lives by buying what they've just produced, ultimately expanding the economy, which creates more jobs. Money spent in the private sector always creates many more jobs than investment in weapons, because consumable goods are produced. In the realm of employment and defense spending, there are those who say that we need a military industry in order to keep our employment high. And there are those also who say that if you take $1 billion and you put it to work in education, for instance, you create I believe it's a 2-to-1 factor. You create twice as many jobs. What is your feeling about this?
Well, it would be a sad commentary on the free enterprise system or capitalism or whatever it is called if one took the position that it could only sustain itself as a result of the investment in these ghastly weapons, which, if we don't get them under control by SALT II, will destroy us all. And I don't think that I'm quite that critical of capitalism, of the system. Indeed, I would strongly argue that if what we can save by a decent system of restraint through SALT II, we can use many times over for education. Certainly we have a lot of kids that are not going to school or not going to decent schools, and we have a lot of teachers that are underpaid. But we also have a squalid situation in our central cities where there's an enormous requirement for investment, and we have the need to find alternative supplies of energy, and we need to find, above all, the investment that will help us to conserve energy, investment in mass transportation, investment in our railroads, investment in alternative forms of heating, architecture that conserve energy. So the notion, which has been common in the past, that the system requires arms expenditure for full employment, and as I say, is not only a bad advertisement for the system, but I think is really quite wrong.
For decades, continuous emphasis on military production has focused much of the nation's best talent and productive wealth on weapons development, while investment has been declining in the private sector. American companies must compete in world markets with companies from Europe and Asia, whose governments heavily subsidize civilian research and development. The growth of imports and the devaluation of the dollar are part of an economic chain reaction that increases with the increases in defense spending. This results in a further shrinking of the American economy and decline in U.S. productivity. Since American companies are guaranteed their profits on every military contract, there is little incentive for them to risk investment in the consumer market on a new product that is not guaranteed to make a profit. Since American companies don't pursue new products and foreign companies do, the American company eventually winds up out of the market and solely dependent on defense contracts for survival. Those who are left unemployed by this process are also supported by the government. Do you feel that there is a tie-in somehow between the amount of money that is spent for military purposes and the lack of money that is spent for educational purposes, and how that affects one worker's productivity?
Well, I would put the tie in, yes, I would think that's one of the ties, but I would, I think this is an extremely important question, and I would put it in slightly different form. Again, as part of the case for getting our outlays for weaponry and our outlays for missiles under control. Let me stop here and say that I think the case for getting the missiles under control, the case for SALT II, is the case against reciprocal suicide. I don't want to see my children and my children's children destroyed, and I think the Russians in this matter are equally sensible. They have had, indeed, more experience of the ghastly impact of mass destruction, war, than we've had. So that, I think, is the main case. But there should be no doubt in anyone's mind that one of the causes of our reduced productivity since World War II has been the fact that we have been spending a very large amount of our income, in comparison, very large in comparison, not large in comparison with the Soviets. They've been spending heavily too, but large in comparison with the Japanese and the Germans. They have had capital available for their civilian industry. We have used the same capital in very large amounts for investment in military plant. Their civilian investment has meant that they have modern, efficient factories where the general tendency of countries as they mature for people to to work somewhat less hard is offset by good machinery, where we have not had that same level of civilian investment, and where, in consequence, our competitive position vis-a-vis the Japanese and vis-a-vis the Germans has been declining. If I could digress here for a moment, I remember Senator Fulbright coming to this point some years ago when he was head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, commenting that what a great favor we had done the Germans and the Japanese when, defeating them in a war, we had in effect put a ceiling on their military expenditures and forced them to be much more efficient in their civilian expenditures. And this is again part of the case for getting our arms expenditures under control.
Okay, when we produce arms, and the Germans and the Japanese, and we must compete with them in the same markets with the Germans and the Japanese on a consumer basis, not only have we relinquished, in many cases, those consumer markets, but are we not also producing non-consumable products when we produce that? So we're taking our own raw materials and our own resources at the same time.
You put the matter very well. I would completely agree. The thing I was focusing on is the fact that they have been using their investment funds for new civilian plant. We have been using it for the weapons of mass destruction. And this has given them their competitive edge, or a large part of their competitive edge in automobiles, in television, in textiles, other consumers' goods. And this is the most direct effect. But that they have also been using their best labor for civilian goods, and they have been using their raw materials for civilian production, is something which I should have added. I'm glad to be reminded of it. We should not expect that if we produce unsaleable, use our resources and our skills and our intelligence for the production of unsaleable and unusable weapons of mass destruction, or if we seek our distinction in the world as a supplier of advanced weaponry, highly sophisticated weapons, that we shouldn't doubt that we will accelerate our decline as a competitive force.
I've always felt that there are enough things that our society needs, so that if we concentrate our resources in building them, we don't have to build unnecessary arms. Also, I think you have to recognize that the arms business is not labor-intensive, particularly when you're dealing with strategic nuclear arms. In the absence of SALT, our land-based ICBM force would become much more vulnerable to attack. Even with SALT, there will be some increase in vulnerability because of the increases in the accuracy of the warheads on both sides. That's why, as I say, it's very fortunate that we made the decisions we made back in the 50s and 60s to diversify those forces. But let me give you just one illustration. As you know, the President has decided to go ahead with the so-called MX in a mobile basing mode, which means that the missile can move around from shelter to shelter. The idea behind that is to increase the number of fixed targets that the Soviet Union would have to strike in order to have any degree of confidence that they could conduct a strike to eliminate our land-based ICBMs. With SALT, we limit the number of Soviet warheads that could be deployed against that force. Without SALT, MX would be a waste of money because they could add so many additional warheads that they could target all of those fixed shelters. So those that argue for MX but argue against SALT are shooting themselves in the foot. As a matter of fact, what SALT does is to restrict certain Soviet programs that otherwise would pose more of a strategic threat to the United States, while enabling us to go ahead with the modernization programs for each third of our deterrent triad. It's not a favor we're doing for the Soviet Union. So those who suggest we ought to hold up SALT because of 2,500 Russians in Cuba don't understand SALT. It's not anything we can use as a bribe because it's something that we want for our own security. The Soviet Union complained bitterly when the United States changed its mind about withdrawing the American troops from Korea. They didn't cancel SALT. Now, if the Soviet Union always behaved the way we would want them to behave, then why would you need SALT?
It is ironic that those in Congress who are the most critical of government spending should be the same people who advocate massive government increases to the defense industry, the most inflationary sector of government spending. The fact is that the health of the economy is determined to a large extent by federal economic policy. And since World War II, that policy has made America the world supplier of weapons. Historically, it is documented that defense spending is highly inflationary. The more you spend on weapons, the more inflation will be. It is no wonder that America is seeing inflation on the rise, because you cannot control inflation without controlling defense spending.
But let us assume that the race continues and that we somehow avoid the Armageddon, somehow avoid the Holocaust. The effect of it will be a continued commitment of our manpower, of our factories, of our capital, to things that we cannot enjoy, and similarly, of course, as regards the Soviet Union, and as continued weakness in our position vis-a-vis that of the countries which are increasingly, ever increasingly, becoming formidable competition for us.
How much money would you estimate was saved by SALT I?
Well, I think one should be very suspicious of any estimates, and certainly one from Galbraith or anybody else on that. All we know is that it set in motion the restraining process, and that SALT II carries it a step further, and that SALT III then will go yet, one hopes, yet further. It is part of the process of rationality, which if we didn't have it, Lord knows what we would be spending. But the Lord knowing, I don't. As long as we have no restraint, such as one hopes for in SALT II, on expenditures for weapons of reciprocal destruction, then a whole sector of the American economy is in the service of the government and doing what the government tells. If we can get that under restraint, have more for civilian expenditure, we'll have a larger sector of the economy which is at the behest of the consumer, at the behest of the market, at the behest of the public, and a smaller sector that's under the command of the government. So that one of the cases for SALT II that any conservative to which any conservative should respond, and I hope conservatives will respond, is that it reduces the role of the government in the economy. It reduces the command role of the government in the economy.
Professor Galbraith, if you could sum up what the American people should feel about the process of SALT, strategic arms limitations treaties, and nuclear disarmament in the long run. I think the audience would appreciate that.
I would say that this is a part of a process over which I would wish that every American would be aroused, so that the people who are fighting this battle in Washington, the senators who are fighting this battle, who are under the gun on this, diverted by arguments of a few hundred or a few thousand Russians in Cuba, diverted by the sudden discovery that this or that might not be subject to this or that inspection. All of those arguments that the opposition, which is well organized, very sophisticated, can produce, that those people who are fighting that in Washington, fighting that battle in the Senate, need the support of everybody. Every thinking person with an instinct for his own survival, I would urge to be on the side of those people who are sharing our interest in survival.
In the 200 years since the American Revolution, the nature of war has changed profoundly, and the cost of building weapons is proving to be as costly to our nation as war itself. The federally subsidized defense industry has a profound effect on the free market economy, and the greater the amount of defense spending, the more the natural checks and balances of that economy are disrupted. Government spending has created a chain reaction whereby more and more companies jump on the bandwagon of government-guaranteed profits for defense contracts, leaving fewer and fewer American companies to develop competitive products for domestic consumption and export. Of all government spending, the most inflationary is defense-related, and if we are to control inflation, we must take a long, hard look at military spending. Without a strategic arms limitation treaty, we will enter an unrestrained arms race that will not only further damage our economic base, but will enhance the chances of nuclear war.
I had a chance last year to go to Hiroshima and to speak at the institute there, at the college there, and to be at Ground Zero and go on up to the medical facilities and go through the museum there. We really, in our generation, in this generation at this time, really begin to lose track of the absolute devastation of that kind of a weapon system. What we're talking about now in our nuclear arsenal are three Hiroshimas. Those are the basic weapon systems that come on out of any one of our Polaris or from our bombers. A single bomber now carries more megatonnage than was dropped in all of World War II. I mean, the statistics are just absolutely mind-boggling.